I played through Quake 4. I finished it earlier today. Quake 4 is a game that I have owned for quite a while, but I never played just because I never got around to it. I'm also not the biggest Quake fan. I'm more of a Doom guy. I think I've talked about this before. Doom is one of my favorite games. Doom 1 and 2 combined, because they're kind of the same game, in my opinion. But Quake, by contrast, didn't really get me in the same way that Doom did. Even though I love Doom and I love that genre, I love the whole genre of the boomer shoots, the arcadey style 90s shooters. People love Quake a lot. A lot of its enduring legacy is because of its multiplayer, right? That's what a lot of people remember from it, and that and Quake 2. I'm not a multiplayer guy with these games, so I can only really speak on the campaigns, and I am not a huge fan of the campaigns for Quake 1 or 2. Quake 1, I guess, as a quick rundown. My throat's getting dry, and I have allergies that are making it feel sore. So I gotta hydrate up. Quake 1 is a pretty good campaign. I am not a fan of the way that a lot of the enemies are very bullet spongy. That was a sort of necessity of the time because the hardware wasn't able to render a lot of enemies on screen like they could with Doom. So there are less enemies, and therefore the enemies had to be a lot tankier. And they're just bullet sponges, which I don't like as much as Doom, where there were a bunch of enemies that you can take out with like a single shotgun blast or something. In Quake, it feels less powerful, I suppose, because everything takes so fucking long to kill by contrast. People love the movement. I'm fine on Quake movement. I weirdly enough, I kind of like Doom movement more. I feel like I go faster in Doom. Maybe it's because I'm bad at Quake. The Quake campaign kind of falls off, especially near the end. Aesthetically, they're going for this Lovecraft thing, and then they end up with like hell stuff again, because you can really feel the moment in that game where the devs the guys that did threw up their hands and were like, let's just make it like Doom, which was a real thing that happened. That was actually like part of the development of that game because it was so stressful and chaotic. And they lost John Romero during it. That makes it sound like he died. He basically decided that was going to be his last game there. Chaotic, messy development of Quake 1 leads into Quake 2, which has a very underwhelming campaign again. I think I described it way long ago on this podcast when I played it as the socialism of power fantasies, because it's all evenly distributed. Everyone gets their equally distributed government power fantasy, and none of it feels very good. It feels fine, but it doesn't. You never get the highs that you would in previous id games. It's very formulaic. It's very standardized. It feels like they're trying to keep up with the times in sort of half-hearted ways. Like, the levels are designed in the same way, except where, they're kind of like a little bit labyrinthine, and you sort of explore them and find keys and progress after you find stuff and open up secret doors and stuff. Except now there's like an objective, a line that says like, objective, get the key, whereas it used to just be all you have to figure out that you need to get this key, and the level design would kind of tell you what to do. It's the exact same here, except now there's a thing that says objective, get the key, and you don't even like notice that there's objectives. Like, they just, I think Civi says it great. It's like, yeah, the objectives just complete themselves. Kind of an underwhelming game, just sort of goes by, and very workman-like feeling. Nothing really surprising. Tries to have a little bit of a plot, and then the last boss, you kill it, and you're like, oh, that was the last boss? That was it? Okay. So Quake 3 comes out. It's a purely multiplayer game. I've only played Quake Live, which is basically just Quake 3. I played for like 20 minutes on some random server and got stomped and was like, all right, it's Quake Live. I'm not really interested in the multiplayer only games. And now we go to Quake 4. And what does Quake 4 decide to do? Because there's a weird... Quake has had a weird identity crisis. Quake 1 is about Lovecraft, except until it decides to not be. Quake 2 is about these alien Strogg guys who are like body horror, bioorganic things, like cyborg thing, aliens. Quake 3 is just multiplayer with no plot at all. Quake 4, not developed by id, developed by Raven Software, who were collaborators with id. They made Heretic. They were the first studio to get the Doom engine, id Tech 2, I believe, officially licensed, and they made Heretic with it, which was overseen by John Romero. Raven, also known for other games. I want to go through a couple. I want to look at the list. Star Wars Jedi Knight, Soldier of Fortune. They did Hexen, which is a sequel to Heretic. They did a lot of pretty cool games. Star Wars Jedi Knight 2, Jedi Outcast, and Jedi Academy. And now they make Call of Duty. So they're in the Call of Duty mines. And that's where they've been relegated. But before that, they made Quake 4. And for Quake 4, they decided to go back to Quake 2 for inspiration. They decided not to continue with the Lovecraft theme, but expand on the alien thing. The alien body horror shit. So Quake 4 is an interesting game. It's a good game, but it also is nothing like its predecessors. So first of all, it has a completely different approach to level design, a totally different philosophy. Quake 4 is the epitome of a corridor shooter. You go down hallways, occasionally leading into larger open areas, and you just go from door to door, shooting monsters that pop out when you walk to certain areas, heavily scripted. Man, you can really tell when Half-Life came out. You can really tell. Because, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just like, wow, this is very based on like very linear, not a lot of, basically zero exploration. You're practically on rails. Sometimes you're literally on rails. And you're being taken on a ride through the game. So how does Quake 4 fare as a corridor shooter? Pretty good. It's not exactly my type of game. Not a type of game that super appeals to me specifically in the shooter genre. But I think as they go, fairly high quality. It has a decent level of challenge. I played it on the second highest difficulty because I wasn't sure exactly, like, is the hardest difficulty, like, sometimes it's too hard. I usually go for, like, the second highest on these games. And I got a pretty decent challenge out of it. Some parts of it were a little easy, but definitely ratcheted up near the end. Had a decent difficulty curve. The shooting feels pretty good. It feels pretty good. This does also have bullet spongy enemies. There's like nothing that dies in one shotgun blast unless you get very lucky with the damage spread. So it still does have that. So to me personally, that doesn't feel like quite as good, you know? But in general, the moving and shooting feels good. This is going to have spoilers. If I'm going to talk about the movement, I have to get into spoilers. So I'll get into the plot, I guess. So the game opens, and it is a direct sequel to Quake 2, which I found kind of surprising, but sort of neat. You're playing as the same character, the same main character from Quake 2, who has blown up the Macron, which was like their leader, and blown up something else. I don't know. I didn't really care what was happening in Quake 2. And now you are on you're on like their home, the Strogg's home planet, or the Strogg. They say Strogg. You're on the Strogg's home planet. And you're launching an assault on it to take them out once and for all. And that's what the game is about. It is Space Marine, hoorah, military, shoot some aliens, Starship Troopers kind of thing. So very simple premise. And where do I start exactly with it? This is a pretty good looking game for 2005. The textures are a little low quality, but other than that, like in terms of lighting, holds up very well, I have to say. Character models, animations, it's a good looking game. The movement at the start of the game is not great. I was a little like iffy on it, because when I think of Quake, I associate Quake with fast, frenetic, very fluid movement, you know? It's like the original speedrun game. Not the original, but a very important speedrun game in the history of speedrunning. And when you jump into Quake 4 and the base, so like the running speed is about as fast as like Quake 2's walking speed. It is very slow and methodical, and it gets a little bit old. I was like, if the whole game was going to be like that, I don't know if I would have liked it too much. I would have been probably a little more lukewarm on it. It doesn't feel great. I love shotguns in these games, and having slow movement like that naturally nerfs weapons like the shotgun. So I was delighted to find out that there is a horrifying sequence in the middle of this game. After like the first third of the game, you are abducted. There is a genuinely great sequence where you are abducted by the Strogg, and you're on like a conveyor belt. So okay, the Strogg always had one of the cool parts, and what I appreciate that Raven really leaned into when they were taking the Quake 2, all that stuff from Quake 2 and expanding on it, is they really leaned on the body horror element of the Strogg. The Strogg were like these bizarre, fleshy, mutant-looking things with all sorts of mechanical parts and cyborg elements and exposed wiring, and they looked gross. They're like gross and grimy. And in Quake 2, they have all this little attention to detail and these tiny little animations that they do, which the player often doesn't even see. There's just like the Strogg are like visually a compelling enemy force in terms of just how gross and horrifying they are. And it's kind of implied that they take people and then they take organic life and then modify it to Stroggify it. The Stroggification process. So there's a part in this game, and they really show you in Quake 4, like, there is some gnarly imagery in this game of like human experimentation and surgeries and cutting people up and just like a severed head stuck into like a bunch of wires, or just a torso that's like wriggling around. Like it's gross, it's nasty. And you get captured and you're on this conveyor belt, like strapped into like a bed, and it's so grisly. You're like, you're going through you're being put through the Stroggification process, and you see most of it. The thing is you're not the first in line. There's a guy in front of you, so you see everything that's about to happen to you happen to that guy, and you just see like the big needle come down, and like you don't see the exact, because of the angle, like you don't see the exact insertion, but you see the arm go down, and then behind like the back of the bed, like the pod that he's in, and then like the screaming, and then you're like, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, and then you get a first person, like it's a first person fucking live surgery. Like crazy. Very memorable sequence, like oh my god, the fucking buzzsaw comes down, and like I'm going like, oh, like I'm like cringing and like jumping back in my seat because it's so gnarly. It's so intense. Very, very memorable sequence that really spices it up, and I think sells you on how evil the Strogg are and how twisted they are as a kind of one-dimensional alien villain, right? They you see like how fucked up they are. And there's this whole like mind control process that gets interrupted, and now you're like part Strogg. You have like Strogg technology in you and stuff, and there's cyborgs and all that shit and all that. And the first thing you notice after you are Stroggified is, hey, I move a lot faster now. So a third of the way into the game, you basically get classic Quake movement back, and it feels way better. It feels way better. I was very relieved when I realized what was going on and what had happened, and that they were kind of building up. Okay, it was actually kind of effective that you start off the game feeling a little bit weak and slow, even though it doesn't make too much sense coming from, this is supposed to be the same guy from Quake 2. And now you're able to like jump and run way faster. You can't do like rocket jumping. That's because there's a lot more self-damage in this game, but that's not a real problem because you never really need to rocket jump because the levels are all, they're just hallways. They're just they're like mostly enclosed spaces. And the level design is mostly based around like, if you can't get up to an area, you're probably supposed to go there later for something else, you know? So the game really, it's funny because the game, it starts off okay. You know, I wasn't super into how it played. And then it kind of just gets better. The game really does pick up after that first third, after the Stroggification scene. And I think the level design is pretty consistent, although you do get very familiar with the game's tricks. I realized eventually that if I wanted to safely reload, I would just have to stop moving, because if I walked any further, I could trigger an enemy to come out. It is very much like a jump scare house. It's a spook house where you walk through and, you set off the scare to come out. There is a good amount of horror in this game. There's a very clear attempt to kind of... It's sort of funny. This game is 2005. It is 2005. Yeah, it is 2005. Yeah. So, kind of makes me... let me just... Wait, hang on. Doom 3... was 2004. That is so interesting, because when I was playing it, I was like, man, this really feels like a reaction to the reaction to Doom 3. Like, so first of all, it's a lot more of a horror game. It's like a horror shooter. I would compare it. I would call Quake 4 a horror shooter. So much dark. This is a dark game. Even when I turn the brightness up, I usually turn the brightness up because I hate squinting to see stuff in games. It was still hard to see shit, and you've got to use your flashlight. So in Doom 3 they did this similar kind of horror shooter thing, and one of the deals with that game was you had a flashlight, but you could only take the flashlight out if you put your weapon away. So people joked about how, like, there's no duct tape on Mars, you know? You can't just duct tape... What, you can't just duct tape it to your weapon? And so that's why... So there was, like, a duct tape mod that you could have your flashlight out with your weapon, and the re-release of Doom 3 had that just as a built-in feature. And a lot has been said of the effects of that on the game. That, number one, yeah, it does make the game easier to see, but also the game was designed with, gun versus visibility in mind. Quake 4 feels like a good balance between that, because only 2 guns actually have flashlights on them. The pistol, which you're probably not going to be using, and that has infinite ammo, so you're always going to be able to switch to it to use the flashlight. And the machine gun, which is the second gun that you get, which is just the rapid fire hit scan weapon of the game. Pretty good machine gun, all things considered. So, but it's not very powerful. It's not especially powerful. And so, especially later on in the game, you know, you want to have your strong weapons out. You want to have like the nail gun. You want to have the rocket launcher. You want to have even like the shotgun's pretty strong. And none of those have flashlights on them. So if you want to have visibility, you do have to make a trade-off. You can still shoot. You can still defend yourself. But you have to make the trade-off of weaker weapon versus more visibility. And I think it's actually pretty good. I actually like the way that it was implemented. I felt like I was genuinely making decisions about what I was going to be able to react to. Because there's enemies who just blend into the dark. There were multiple times where I literally walked into an enemy because it was so dark. And I didn't even know it was shooting me. You know, because they were hiding around a corner, and I walked past the corner, and then they were there, and I was, oh my god, they're there. Like, I got jump scared, basically. So it's like, it's a real thing. The game feels designed around it. It's very simple in a lot of ways. You do get very used to the game's tricks and the way that it flows, you know. There's gonna be a locked door, and then you'll be talking to someone, and then you're in this room, and you have to go talk to someone, and they're like, great, let's go further. And then you can literally just see the door unlock in front of you, go from like red to green. And it's like, all right, you know, it's very transparent in the way that it's designed, in the way that all the flags are set up. Not in a bad way. I think if it was longer, it might get a little bit tiresome. But it's a pretty modest. How much time did I spend on it? 11.9 hours. Let's take that down because I think I walked away for a second or for like a little bit. Let's take that down from like roughly 12 hours to like 10 hours. Yeah, I think 10 hours is probably fair. Like 10 hours on one of the harder difficulties is pretty decent for a game that has that. It didn't feel like it was getting stale. The last couple levels go by very quickly. I thought they were going to get longer as I went on, but no. There's one that's like literally an elevator ride, and that's it. And nothing even, you don't even have to do anything on an elevator ride. You just watch something happen from outside. Yeah, I mean, okay, it does carry the id Quake tradition of having kind of a lame final boss. There was like a boss earlier. It's the first boss you fight with a health bar, the like corrupted soldier guy, the mutated soldier dude, who gave me way more trouble than the final boss. Final boss was like a complete pushover. I beat it in one try. Just shoot rockets at him. Just shoot rockets and nail guns and the black hole gun and the electro beam and all that, and just shoot that at him. He dies very quickly, and then I was like, oh, okay, now there's a second phase, and then the second phase is just as easy, and then there's a third phase. The third phase is maybe even easier, and then it's over, and I was like, all right, cool. That was it. I feel like most id games have a curse of ending with a that was it. But yeah, pretty solid game all around. Pretty good like horror shooter. Leans into the I think the good parts. The compelling parts of Quake 2 that were interesting. Not a huge fan of like the corridor shooter aspect of it, but for what it is, the action is pretty consistent. The way they build up tension is good. It can get predictable at times, but there were also points where I was caught off guard. Not a perfect game by any means, but honestly, pretty good. It does contribute to the Quake identity crisis thing. I think most people agree now that if you were going to do a Quake reboot, you would really want to expand on the Lovecraft stuff from the first game, because that feels like the least developed. Honestly, I think if you liked the Strogg stuff, I think Quake 2 and Quake 4 are probably pretty satisfactory, all things considered. There's even a couple references, like things that feel like they're straight out of Quake 1. Like there's a couple music stings and stuff like that. I might be misremembering. Oh, the zombies. Yeah, the zombies in this game are just like the Quake zombies. I thought that was cool. Yeah, I think the Strogg stuff has been pretty well explored, and this game does a good job of giving that good development. What I would want to see from a remake would be the Lovecraft stuff, the weird creatures, the cults and things like that. I think that's the most compelling place that they could go with the series. That's what I would like to see. It's also not a theme that's very explored, you know? I'm good on Space Marines in video games for now, besides Space Marine 2, which I'm going to be buying next month. So, yeah, Quake 4, good game. Good game.